My name is David Wilson. I'm in the History Department and the Mechanical Engineering Department here at Iowa State. Before I introduce the man who will introduce the speaker, I wanted to say one or two things. And the first thing is that this lecture tonight is actually the first in a series of 3 lectures that will take place here during the year. The overall title for the series of lectures is Science and Technology and Public Policy in the Modern Period. The other 2 lecturers who will be here they'll both be here during the spring quarter. The first one is Arnold Thackeray, who is the chairman of the Department of History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. And he'll be talking about attempts by modern democracies to measure in a quantitative way progress in research in science and technology. And the other speaker is Professor Garland Allen, who is at Washington University in St. Louis. He's in the Department of Biology there and has written a good deal about the history of modern biology. He'll be talking about the eugenics movement in the United States. And as I say, both of those lectures will be during the spring quarter, and there will be an appropriate amount of publicity so you'll all know exactly when they are. Now, the other thing is, you will have noticed if you've looked at any of the posters advertising the talk tonight, that at the bottom of the poster there are various organizations and departments listed as co-sponsors of this talk. The organization on there that is really important is the Sperry and Hutchinson Company, because this talk and the whole series of talks has been made possible by a grant given to Iowa State University by the S&H Foundation, which is sponsored by the Sperry and Hutchinson Company. Now, these people, the Sperry and Hutchinson Company, are best known for S&H green stamps. And I've had visions ever since we got the grant of the history department being inundated by S&H green stamps, being swamped by them with historians trying to figure out exactly what we could trade them in for. And you will have noticed that we did get a new chairman this year. Anyway, we are honored to have with us tonight a representative of the Sperry and Hutchinson Company, who got up very early this morning to fly out from New York to be here for the first of our lecturers. And he also happens to be a graduate of Iowa State University. And I'd like for him to stand up now, Mr. Ted Hampe, over here. These must be all of my students, I can tell, because they're coming in late. And now the man who will introduce our speaker for tonight is a man whose own career touches very directly on matters of public policy, because he's a state representative from Ames, Mr. Reed Crawford.
Following tonight's lecture, you may ask questions of Dr. Carol Purcell. Dr. Carol Purcell is an outstanding educator, having several academic appointments and known very well in his field. He has received the Andrew W. Mellon Distinguished Professor of Humanities, Lehigh University, from 74 to 76, and he is currently the Visiting Research Professor, Center for 20th Century Studies, University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee this fall. He is also the organizer of the forthcoming Conference on Critical Issues in the History of Technology. And despite what one's vita might say, it's many times they don't get into this particular area. I've also found that he has a good sense of humor. He told me as we came up here that this would be the first time that he's ever followed a Republican without having stepped in something. Whether that's true or not, I really don't know. But I think this is a very good opportunity for students and for the faculty and for townspeople of Ames to listen to Dr. Carol Purcell. He is speaking to us tonight on the American ideal of a democratic technology from Jefferson to ecology. Dr. Carol Purcell.
There has been, throughout American history, a continuing, if not indeed continuous, realization that, as Lewis Mumford phrased it, those who are concerned with maintaining democratic institutions must see to it that their constructive efforts include technology itself. In 1815, Thomas Jefferson, asked to comment on a steam engine developed by a fellow American, compared it to those he had seen in Europe, and articulated the American ideal of a democratic technology scaled to human needs. Writing to this inventor, he said, "I see indeed in yours the valuable properties of simplicity, cheapness, and accommodation to the small and numerous calls of life. And the calculations of its power appear sound and correct. The importance of your construction will be enhanced by the consideration that a smaller engine, applicable to our daily concerns, is infinitely more valuable than the greatest, which can be used only for great objects. For these interest the few alone, the former the many. I once had an idea that it might be possible to economize the steam of a common pot, kept boiling in the kitchen fire until its accumulation should be sufficient to give a stroke. And although the strokes might not be rapid, there would be enough of them in the day to raise from an adjacent well the water necessary for daily use, to wash the linen, knead the bread, beat the hominy, churn the butter, turn the spit, and do all other household offices which require only a regular mechanical motion. Of how much more value would this be to ordinary life than Watson Bolton's 30 pairs of millstones to be turned by one engine? Well, the same desire for a technology scaled to everyday human needs, which are of interest to most of us, persists still in America and has found a recent voice in the movement for what is called appropriate technology. This dream and its antithetical nightmare have been described best, I think, by Lewis Mumford in the whole body of his work, but most succinctly in his 1964 essay entitled Authoritarian and Democratic Techniques. My thesis, he wrote, is that from late Neolithic times in the Near East, right down to our own day, two technologies have recurrently existed side by side. One authoritarian, the other democratic. The first system-centered, immensely powerful, but inherently unstable. The other man-centered, relatively weak, but resourceful and durable. The authoritarian centralized techniques drew on inventions and scientific discoveries of a high order: the written record, mathematics and astronomy, irrigation and canalization. Above all, it created complex human machines composed of specialized, standardized, replaceable, interdependent parts: the work army, the military army, the bureaucracy. From the beginning, these work armies and military armies raised the ceiling of human achievement in both construction and destruction. In our own time, these techniques have provided the masses with an astonishing array and abundance of material goods. But as Mumford warns, by progressively fulfilling this part of the democratic promise, our system has achieved a hold over the whole community that threatens to wipe out every other vestige of democracy. Opposed to this is a democratic techniques. In Mumford's words, the small-scale method of production, resting mainly on human skill and animal energy, but always, even when employing machines, remaining under the active direction of the craftsman or the farmer. Each group developing its own gifts through appropriate arts and social ceremonies, as well as making discreet use of the gifts of nature. Well, the conflict between these two techniques has waxed and waned throughout recorded history, but its modern intensification began at the same time as the United States. Brooke Hindle has called the simultaneity of the American and the Industrial Revolutions one of the staggering coincidences of American history. Mumford is more apprehensive than excited by the juxtaposition. At the very moment, he wrote, when Western nations threw off the ancient regimes of absolute government, operating under a once divine king, they were restoring this same system in a far more effective form in their technology, reintroducing coercions of a military character no less strict in the organization of a factory. Well, the resulting conflict has two facets, both of which have drawn attention throughout our history. In order to ensure the survival of democracy, one must preserve a democratic techniques. But to do this, first one must keep authoritarian techniques from concentrating in the hands of the few. And second, one must at the same time provide easy access to a democratic technology for the many. The prospect was hopeful during the years of the early republic, and as Hugo Meyer and others have pointed out, it soon became a major canon of our American faith that democracy and technology were symbiotic, that political, social, and economic liberty would cause technology to flourish, and that technology in turn would help to defend and extend such liberty. Asserting in 1792 that free governments are the only asylum and nursery for science and the arts, a conceit which fooled us just 20 years ago this month into expecting the Russians not to be able to orbit a satellite, which they put up at the same time we brought out the Edsel, by the way. You can remember those two things that way. Saying that free governments are the only asylum and nursery for science and the arts, Joseph Barnes in 1792 explained, free governments have always been found most disposed to encourage the rise and progress of science and the arts. And for this obvious reason, that in republican governments, merit alone is or ought to be the standard of character, which necessarily excites that laudable spirit of emulation so essential to society, and which never fails to produce celebrated philosophers, statesmen, husbandmen, and artists. The necessary effect of which is not only the promotion of science and useful arts, but the happiness of men, the primary, the grand object of their existence. And summarizing his argument, he said, philosophy being the source of liberty, liberty of all improvements in science and the arts, the improvement in science and the arts of all the real accomplishments of the human species. Consequently, philosophy is essentially the source of all virtue. Paradoxically, Barnes developed this argument to argue against the strict patent law of 1790, under which Secretary of State Jefferson was granting monopolies with a parsimony upsetting to inventors. Few apparently were willing to take the course of Benjamin Franklin with regard to his Pennsylvania fireplace. Instead of accepting a patent proffered by the governor of Pennsylvania, He advertised it instead in a pamphlet, complete with drawings, description, and instructions to masons for setting up the fireplace, and published at his own expense. He declined the patent, he said, from a principle which has ever weighed with me on such occasions, viz., that as we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any inventions of ours, and this we should do freely and generously. Well, so long as technology relied upon the energy of sun and wind and water, the triumph of authoritarian techniques appeared unlikely, or at least easily avoidable. The nation was recently set up as a republic, not a monarchy. A standing army had been explicitly rejected. The potential energy of woods and farmland, of falling water and blowing wind were widely and all but freely available, and the technology to harness them was cheap and widely known. And the sources of such energy could not be easily monopolized. As Jefferson had hoped, there was still an emphasis in the early republic upon a democratic techniques. Even the coming of the American system of manufactures seemed to strengthen the democratic nature of American technology. In 1849, the touring Scottish chemist James F.W. Johnston visited an agricultural fair in Syracuse, New York. And he noted that the general character of the implements was economy in construction and in price. And the exhibition was large and interesting. Plows, hay rakes, forks, scythes, and cooking stoves, he said, were very abundant, and many of them well and beautifully made. The potato grips and forks of various kinds, cut from sheet steel, were very elastic, light, strong, and cheap. And only a few years later, the British machine makers Whitworth and Wallace wrote that labor-saving machines are most successfully employed in the manufacture of agricultural implements. In a plow manufactory at Baltimore, they said 8 machines are employed in the various parts of the woodwork. With these machines, 7 men are able to make the wooden parts of 30 plows per day. And one result of this extension of the American system from small arms, where it was born, to the manufacture of plows, was that the implements made at this factory sold for as little as $2.50. Surely the democratic nature of agricultural technology during the 19th century, and therefore its relatively low price, was as important as free land in extending a nation of yeoman farmers across the continent. The American system, of course, with its machine designers and tenders, did not encompass the entirety of American technology. Many areas, farming and the building trade spring to mind, long resisted the intrusion of machine logic. This is one reason why Americans were able, even when they were not forced to move from job to job with easy proficiency. Whitworth and Wallace noted that the citizen of the United States knows that matters are different from him than with the workers of Britain, and seems really to pride himself in not remaining overlong at any particular occupation, and being able to turn his hand to some dozen different pursuits in the course of his life. Karl Marx at one point quoted a Frenchman who had moved to San Francisco. "I was firmly convinced," said the Frenchman, "that I was fit for nothing but letterpress printing. But once in the midst of this world of adventurers who change their occupation as often as they do their shirts, begad, I did as the others. As mining did not turn out remunerative enough, I left for the town, where in succession I became a typographer, slater, plumber, etc. In consequence of thus finding out that I am fit for any sort of work, I felt less of a mollusk and more of a man." Well, it's been said that America was the only country that began perfect and hoped to improve. And not content to leave well enough alone, Americans wanted progress, and progress, as it turned out, was away from this democratic technique. Early in the century, Oliver Evans, after Benjamin Franklin, our first great inventor, had confidently asserted that we see by daily experience, and what a startling thing this was, to be able to say in the early 19th century. Couldn't have said it a century before. We see by daily experience that every art may be improved. Late in the century, when Mark Twain's Hank Morgan gained power in King Arthur's court, he recorded that the very first official thing I did in my administration, and it was on the very first day of it, was to start a patent office. For I knew that a country without a patent office and good patent laws was just a crab and couldn't travel any way but sideways or backwards. The first thing you want in a new country, he said, is a patent office, then work up your school system, and after that, out with your newspaper. Well, little wonder that an anonymous scribbler was inspired by an industrial exhibition in 1828 to write these lines: "Genius of art, what achievements are thine, to delight and astonish the mind, the efforts of knowledge and fancy combine. But triumph to thee is assigned. How high swell the bosoms of patriots with pride to behold the rich treasures which here are supplied, while invention's bright wand in the artisan's hand points to glory, the freemen of freedom's own land." But authoritarian techniques was not so easily ignored. The power fantasies of inventors and social engineers such as J.A. Etzler had a democratic appeal, but an authoritarian promise. In 1841, Etzler published a sequel to his book Paradise, which Thoreau had reviewed quite harshly, in which he attempted to prove, as he said, from experience, how to cultivate 20,000 acres by one machine and 3 or 4 men, with a capital of less than $1 per acre, in the most superior mode, how to clear land from trees, stumps, roots, and stones, fill and drain swamps, make dams, canals, ditches, roads, and perform any kind of work in the ground, build houses, and furnish as much inanimate power as desired, forever, for any place and any stationary machine, all by the same system. And in an appeal that was to be echoed many times over the next century in America, Etzler besought, "Ye who are poor and of the laboring class, do not be alarmed at this invention. It will not deprive you of your poor pittance for sustaining life, obtainable now by your petty drudgery. With 20,000 acres when 20,000 acres of garden can be cultivated by 3 or 4 men, with but $1 capital once every year per acre, you may easily become shareholders of joint stock companies by paying from $20 to $30, and even this small sum, partly or entirely, in work of from 1 to 3 months, once forever, and then enjoy the produce of from 10 to 20 acres for each share, without further trouble or expense, and then live like gentlemen and ladies to much better purposes than those of a dull animal in a treadmill." A great promise. And it's surely significant, I think, that this kind of talk of mechanical slavery increased precisely at that point in American history when the slavery of human beings was increasingly condemned. I think we passed very quickly and without thinking much from using people for slaves to using machines for slaves. And the analogy was quite explicit. And the same hope of a life of ease, someone else or something else doing our work for us, lay behind both. In fact, the extension of modern technology to agriculture came not only through the introduction of labor-saving machines, but through a rebirth of the work armies of the ancient Near East. In their recent book on slavery, Time on the Cross, Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman point out that the regimen of the large southern plantation was more like an assembly line, as they say, than the routine of many factories in the antebellum era. And indeed, they go so far as to assert that the great plantations were the first large, scientifically managed business enterprises, and that black slaves were the first group of workers to be trained in the work rhythm which later became characteristic of industrial society. The giant railroad companies of the period were also sources of a growing authoritarian techniques, rationalizing as they did for their own needs and convenience everything from business forms through political corruption to the establishment of local time. Significantly, I think railroads were also among the earliest employers of industrial scientists. Just as significant for many Americans was the fact that such techniques were welcomed despite their sometimes obvious anti-democratic tendencies. Speaking in the aggregates, which were necessary for authoritarian techniques, the astronomer and political economist Simon Newcomb insisted first that the question whether the effect of any policy is good or bad depends very largely upon whether it increases or diminishes the sum total of the products necessary for human welfare. And then he claimed specifically that carrying passengers 40 miles an hour for 2 or 3 cents a mile is a fact which outweighs all we can say about watered stock. He was quite proud of the fact that average working people in the late 19th century could travel faster and cheaper than kings could have a century earlier. And that made it all worthwhile. In one field of American endeavor after another, what Mumford called the machine and the mechanical collective triumphed over democratic techniques. The arts of war and self-government were revolutionized. Agriculture, the backbone of democratic techniques, was industrialized, mechanized, made energy intensive, and ever more efficient. Farmers who could not compete with the new technological system of machines, irrigation, fertilizer, and so forth, fled to the cities and became dependent upon those who stayed behind. These, in their turn, however prosperous, were locked into an ever-tightening circle of technological constraints. With transportation, as with food and most other of life's needs, Americans were asked, or forced, to accept efficient, increased production with its machine logic and rhythms. Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of scientific management, told a congressional committee in 1912, in a period when America seemed to many in the middle class to be coming unstuck with social violence. He said that under the benign rule of scientific management, and I quote him, both sides take their, he means capital and labor, take their eyes off the division of the surplus as the all-important matter, and together turn their attention toward increasing the size of the surplus until this surplus becomes so large that it is unnecessary to quarrel over how it shall be divided. Economic growth, in other words, was to be a substitute for social justice. Well, it was, in short, what Mumford has called the magnificent bribe. By accepting the new techniques and under the democratic authoritarian social compact, each member of the community may claim every material advantage. I'm quoting Mumford. But on one condition, that he must not merely ask for nothing that the system does not provide, but likewise agree to take everything offered, duly processed and fabricated, homogenized and equalized in the precise quantities that the system rather than the person requires. Not everyone, of course, acquiesced willingly in this compact. In 1896, a Minnesota state senator wrote disgustedly to Ignatius Donnelly, "While we think, brag of it, how far we are ahead of any former civilization, I, for one, am disgusted of the bragging and the boasting, and simply believe it is not true. I have heard it asserted that the printing press, telegraph, etc., have educated the masses, that the direful relapse will not come again, as in the past. Bosh. Our would-be masters have a corner on the whole outfit of the inventions, and they are now just as much employed to the destruction of human rights as formerly. In the absence of those inventions, the people's ignorance was used as a means." Well, this corporate and political monopolization of the very technology which was supposed to preserve the people's liberty And I commend to you a recent book by David Noble, America by Design, was one of the problems which motivated those who had still some vision of a democratic techniques. One promising area of reform, and we still see echoes of this, was thought to be electricity. And I present that to you as an example. And by 1915, engineers were confident that they could transmit economical amounts of electricity up to 100 miles from central stations, far enough to provide nearly all Americans with adequate, flexible, cheap, clean, and divisible energy. The fact that as late as 1935, only 10% of American farms were so served, and the fact that rates in the United States, as compared with Canada, for example, were so much higher, led some critics to see in a reform of the electrical utility industry a new opportunity to fulfill that dream of a democratic techniques. In the 1920s, Morris Llewellyn Cook, the progressive engineer, produced for Governor Gifford Pinchot of Pennsylvania a comprehensive giant power plan, which without making power generating capacity public, would have accomplished the twin goals of cheap and abundant available energy. After a limited start in the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1933, the Rural Electrification Administration, set up in 1935 with Cook as the first administrator, finally succeeded in pushing rural lines to nearly all American farms. Paradoxically, the coming of electricity tended as often as not merely to tie the individual farmer